Why would the most powerful military on Earth request 10,000 additional ground troops for a war it claims to be winning? That is the question no one in Washington is answering honestly. The Pentagon says it has struck over 9,000 targets inside Iran. It says it has sunk 140 Iranian naval vessels. It says it has degraded 90% of Iran's ballistic missile and drone launch capability. If those numbers are accurate, and there is no reason to doubt them, then the war should be approaching its conclusion. It is not. It is expanding, and the reason it is expanding has nothing to do with Iranian military strength in the conventional sense. It has everything to do with a structural trap that most coverage of this conflict does not have the analytical framework to identify. What you are watching unfold in the Persian Gulf is not a war being won slowly. It is a war whose entire cost architecture has been inverted. And by the end of this analysis, the mechanism behind that inversion, the specific doctrine driving it, and the direct path from the Strait of Hormuz to your grocery bill and your gas pump will be completely legible. The common assumption about this conflict runs as follows. The United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28th with overwhelming air and naval superiority. The opening strikes destroyed Iranian air defenses, command infrastructure, ballistic missile launchers, and naval assets across more than 90 military sites. Within the first 100 hours, the campaign had cost $3.7 billion, a staggering figure that nevertheless seemed proportionate to the damage inflicted. CENTCOM reported more than 2,500 targets struck in the first 6 days alone. The presumption shared across most Western commentary was that Iran had been functionally disarmed. The Strait of Hormuz would reopen. Oil markets would stabilize. The war would enter a mopping up phase. That presumption is wrong, and the deployment of the 82nd Airborne Division to the Middle East beginning March 24th is the clearest evidence of how wrong it is. The question is not whether America has superior firepower. That was never in dispute. The question is whether superior firepower, applied at a verified rate of $900 million per day, can defeat an adversary whose entire strategy is designed to make that rate of expenditure the mechanism of American strategic defeat. That question points directly to the central analytical failure in how this war has been discussed. Most analysis treats the conflict as a contest of military capability. It is not. It is a contest of cost sustainability. The framework required to understand what is actually happening in the Persian Gulf is not conventional force comparison. It is what strategic analysts call cost imposition theory, the study of how a weaker actor forces a stronger actor to expend resources at a rate that becomes politically and economically unsustainable. And the specific concept at the center of this conflict, the one that makes the entire war legible, is what I call cost imposition inversion. Cost imposition inversion is the structural condition in which a militarily superior power's own force projection becomes the primary mechanism through which a weaker adversary depletes its resources. Iran does not need to destroy the American military. Iran needs to make the American military destroy its own budget. That distinction changes everything about how this war ends, and the numbers that prove it are far worse than most people have been told. The first proof layer is the munitions cost asymmetry, and it is the most devastating number in this entire conflict. Iran's Shahed 136 kamikaze drone costs between $20,000 and $50,000 to produce. It uses off-the-shelf commercial electronics. It can be launched from the back of a truck. It can travel 1,200 miles. The United States intercepts these drones using systems that cost between $2 million and $4 million per shot. Arthur Erickson, chief executive of Helio, a Texas-based drone manufacturer, stated the arithmetic plainly. The cost ratio per interception is at best 10 to 1, and at worst 60 or 70 to 1 in favor of Iran. Run that ratio across more than 2,000 drone launches in the first 100 hours of the war alone, and the scale of the problem becomes structurally irreversible. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, led on this analysis by retired Colonel Mark Cancian, calculated that the first 6 days of the war cost the United States $11.3 billion. By day 12, The estimate rose to $16.5 billion. The daily operational cost settled at approximately $891 million. Iran's daily cost of launching drones and maintaining its asymmetric posture is a fraction of that figure. What does it mean when one side spends nearly $1 billion a day and the other side spends tens of millions? It means the war is not being fought on a battlefield. It is being fought on a balance sheet. And on that balance sheet, the side with the aircraft carriers is losing. This is not a temporary mismatch. Iran has refined the Shahed platform over years of production and export to Russia for use in Ukraine. The manufacturing base is distributed, hardened, and designed for rapid replacement. Even after the United States degraded 90% of Iran's launch capability, the remaining 10% is sufficient to sustain a continuous cost imposition campaign because each launch forces a defensive expenditure that dwarfs the cost of the weapon itself. The mathematics of this asymmetry do not improve with time, they worsen. The second proof layer is the Strait of Hormuz itself, and this is where the analysis reveals the full depth of Iran's strategic design. Roughly 20% of global oil supply transits through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran did not need to sink a single tanker to close it. It used mines, drone threats, and insurance risk to reduce commercial shipping through the strait by more than 90%. This is not a blockade in the traditional naval sense. Kelly Grieco of the Stimson Center described the mechanism precisely. Iran is using local weapons to generate global impact. The effect has been catastrophic for energy markets. Brent crude stood at approximately $65 per barrel before the strikes began on February 28th. By mid-March, it had surged to $126. As of today, March 27th, it sits above $111. Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak warned on Channel 13 that reopening the strait would require the deployment of 2 full American divisions and a commitment to remain for the long haul. That is precisely what is now being considered. The 10,000 additional troops under discussion are not an escalation of confidence. They are an escalation of desperation. The United States cannot end this war from the air because the strategic target is not a military installation. The strategic target is a 21-mile wide waterway lined with mines, monitored by drones, and defended by a doctrine built specifically to turn American intervention into American hemorrhage. But here is the part that most people never hear explained. Iran's strategy has a name. Vali Nasser of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies called it a test of wills and stamina. Ali Vaez, the Iran director at the International Crisis Group, described it with even more structural precision. The Iranians want to spread the pain as much as they can, regardless of the cost to themselves and burned relations with their neighbors, hoping to create enough opposition to the war to compel President Trump to back off. For the Islamic Republic, Vaez added, survival is a victory, even if it is a Pyrrhic one. That statement contains the entire game theory of this conflict in a single sentence. Iran does not define victory as defeating the American military. Iran defines victory as still existing when the American military leaves. The United States, by contrast, must achieve something decisive: the destruction of Iran's nuclear capability, regime change, or permanent neutralization of its asymmetric arsenal to justify the expenditure. That asymmetry in required victory conditions is the structural trap. Iran wins by enduring. America loses by staying. The consequences of this trap are already cascading far beyond the Persian Gulf. Consider the fertilizer market. Roughly a third of the world's fertilizer trade transits through the Strait of Hormuz. Urea prices at the New Orleans hub have risen from $475 per ton before the crisis to $680, a 43% increase. That number translates directly into food prices in every country that imports grain. Pakistan receives 99% of its liquefied natural gas from Qatar and the UAE, both of which export through the strait. Bangladesh receives 72%. India receives 53%. These are not peripheral economies. These are countries with populations totaling over 2 billion people, and their energy supply has been functionally severed. Egypt is watching Suez Canal traffic collapse, with estimated revenue losses of $10 billion because rerouted shipping no longer passes through the canal. Ethiopia, which sources nearly all of its fuel from Gulf states, faces severe price shocks that will compound existing food insecurity. JP Morgan estimates that if Brent crude remains above $100 per barrel through mid-year, global GDP growth will be depressed by 0.6 percentage points on an annualized basis, with the global consumer price index rising by more than 1 full percentage point. The bank describes this as a modest macroeconomic shock, which should alarm anyone who remembers that the 1973 oil embargo, which produced a comparable supply disruption, triggered a global recession that lasted 2 years and reshaped the political economy of the Western world for a decade. The gas price at your local station, which has already climbed past $4 per gallon in most of the United States, is not a temporary disruption. It is a structural consequence of a war whose cost architecture makes resolution more expensive with each passing week. Iran has deliberately targeted fixed economic infrastructure in neighboring Gulf states, striking oil refineries, desalination plants, and port facilities in Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait. Ahmad Sharawi of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies explained the logic. The targeting of civilian infrastructure is designed to inflict maximum damage on these countries, to push Gulf countries to pressure Trump to figure out how to stem the damage. The economic pain is not collateral. It is the weapon. Every dollar spent intercepting a $20,000 drone with a $4 million missile is a dollar that flows directly into the inflationary pressure on your household budget. The Hormuz closure has also introduced what energy analysts are now calling the Hormuz surcharge, a permanent structural premium on oil prices that will persist for years even after the strait eventually reopens, because global shipping insurance markets have repriced Middle Eastern transit risk. Tanker spot rates for very large crude carriers have exceeded $107,000 per day due to rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope. Those costs embed themselves into every supply chain that touches energy, fertilizer, or petrochemical inputs, which is to say, nearly all of them. Now consider what the deployment of 10,000 additional ground troops means within this framework. Karg Island, which handles nearly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports, has been transformed into what military analysts are calling a drone kill zone. Iranian forces have fortified the island with underground trenches, bunkers, minefields, FPV kamikaze drones, and artillery coverage from the mainland, which sits just 15 miles away. Retired U.S. Brigadier General Steve Anderson described holding the island after any initial seizure as the long pole in the tent, meaning the most difficult and resource-intensive element of the entire operation. Between 30,000 and 40,000 Iranian personnel and civilians are already on the island. An amphibious or airborne assault would place American troops directly into a layered asymmetric defense zone designed specifically to maximize casualties using mass-produced drones that cost a fraction of the systems used to defend against them. The geography favors the defender absolutely. Open terrain, no natural cover, short resupply lines for Iran, extended logistics chains for the United States. This is not a battlefield that rewards technological superiority. This is a battlefield that punishes it. Every advanced platform the United States brings into that environment becomes a high-value target for a $500 FPV drone. The cost imposition inversion does not weaken as the war escalates. It deepens. And this is precisely where Western analysts consistently get it wrong. The assumption that escalation favors the stronger party holds only when the stronger party's escalation costs are proportionally lower than the weaker party's. In this conflict, the opposite is true. Every American escalation, from carrier strike groups to Tomahawk barrages to airborne divisions, raises the daily burn rate while Iran's cost of resistance remains structurally flat. Nick Adams, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs, stated the core problem with unusual directness. The Pentagon must rapidly field lower-cost technologies alongside its exquisite capabilities, ensuring each is used where it delivers the greatest advantage. That sentence is an institutional admission that the current cost curve of American warfare is unsustainable against an adversary using this doctrine. The Lucas drone, a reverse-engineered version of the Shahed, costs $35,000 per unit. It exists. It works. It is not deployed at scale. The United States is fighting a 21st century cost imposition war with a 20th century procurement system. And the result is a strategic position that deteriorates with every week of operations. The vulnerability of existing U.S. bases in the Gulf compounds this dynamic. In less than 2 weeks, Iranian forces fired thousands of missiles and drones at American installations across the region, killing 7 U.S. soldiers and wounding at least 140 more. The Pentagon responded by redeploying its Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System from South Korea to the Middle East, a decision that erodes deterrence credibility in East Asia to shore up a defensive posture in a theater where the threats are designed to be cheaper than the defenses. That reallocation is itself a form of cost imposition inversion operating at the alliance level. What winning means for each side crystallizes the trap. For Iran, winning means surviving as a functioning state with its territorial integrity intact and its regional influence preserved. That is a negative objective. It requires endurance, not conquest. For the United States, winning means one of three things: destroying Iran's nuclear program permanently, achieving regime change, or neutralizing Iran's asymmetric capability so thoroughly that the Strait of Hormuz can be reopened and secured without permanent military presence. Each of those objectives requires sustained ground operations, extended logistics, continued high burn rate expenditures, and political will that survives rising domestic inflation and midterm electoral pressure. The structural constraint that prevents quick resolution is the strait itself. As long as the waterway remains mined and threatened, Iran retains its primary lever of global economic disruption, which means the United States cannot claim strategic victory regardless of how many targets it destroys inland. The game theory conclusion is declarative. A power that must achieve a positive strategic outcome against an adversary that wins by merely surviving will always face escalating costs against diminishing returns. That is not a prediction. That is the arithmetic of the conflict as it currently stands. Iran has accepted initial devastation to preserve its escalatory capacity for the phase when American defensive systems are stretched thin and domestic political tolerance for rising costs begins to fracture. The thinking behind this posture, as reported by the New York Times, is that President Trump, facing midterm elections and a skeptical base, will choose to curtail the war before American casualties and inflation climb further. That calculation has historical precedent on its side. The war in Iran is not a test of American military power. It is a test of whether American military power can be converted into a durable strategic result when the adversary's entire doctrine is designed to ensure that conversion fails. The thesis is simple when stated plainly. The deployment of 10,000 additional troops to the Persian Gulf is not a show of strength. It is a structural confession that air power alone cannot resolve a conflict whose center of gravity is economic, not military. Iran's cost imposition inversion has turned American force projection into American resource depletion, and every escalation deepens rather than resolves that dynamic. The historical parallel is not Iraq in 2003, where the initial military victory was swift and the occupation became the quagmire. The parallel is the Soviet-Afghan War of 1979 to 1989, where a technologically superior power committed ground forces into a theater where the defender's cost of resistance was a fraction of the attacker's cost of presence, and where geography systematically favored dispersed asymmetric resistance over concentrated conventional power. The war ended not with military defeat, but with economic and political exhaustion. The Soviet Union spent an estimated $8 billion per year in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen operated on a budget of less than $1 billion, much of it supplied externally. That ratio held for a decade, and it broke a superpower. The ratio in the Persian Gulf today is worse. The purpose of this analysis is not alarm, it is legibility. Understanding the cost imposition structure of this war gives you a framework that no headline and no cable news segment can provide. You are not watching a conflict unfold randomly. You are watching a structural pattern that has a defined trajectory, and that trajectory is measurable. The next unresolved variable is whether the 10,000 troops are approved and deployed, and if so, whether they are committed to a ground operation on Karg Island or positioned as a deterrent presence in Gulf state bases that have already proven vulnerable to Iranian strikes. That decision will determine whether this war remains a costly air campaign or becomes a multi-year ground commitment with no defined exit. Watch three things. First, watch the Brent crude price. If it remains above $100 per barrel through April, the inflationary transmission into food and energy costs becomes structurally embedded rather than transient. Second, watch the mine clearing operations in the Strait of Hormuz. Retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies outlined the process. U.S. planes and armed helicopters will conduct combat air patrols overhead, and the Navy will conduct several sweeps before the first escorts attempt to transit. If those operations have not begun within 2 weeks, the strait is not reopening soon. Third, watch the 82nd Airborne Deployment Orders. That division can deploy within 18 hours of receiving orders. If it moves beyond initial staging to forward operational positioning inside the Gulf, the ground phase of this war has begun, and the cost imposition inversion enters a phase from which there is no easy withdrawal. The numbers do not lie. The structure does not forgive. The trap does not open from the inside.